Indonesia, the world's largest archipelagic country and an emerging Southeast Asian nation. Focusing on a rapid pace of development and business growth, the government is working hard to reform and simplify the country's various regulations and legal frameworks to boost national economic growth. Through the issuance of the Job Creation Law, the government sets new standards for employment concepts and rules to broaden the job opportunities for Indonesian workers. The Omnibus Law merely revoked certain provisions under the prior Manpower Law and issued some important implementing regulations. This must be anticipated by employers to minimize business risks. With the experience of more than 1 decade, ADCO has wide-ranging knowledge and extensive experience in handling all types of employment issues. ADCO has experience in assisting disputing parties, both employers and employees, from industrial disputes, termination, and work formalities. We have successfully assisted one of the biggest stainless steel companies in Indonesia in a mass termination of their employees. We guided the company throughout the termination process to always comply with the regulations and assisted the company with thorough investigations of all business and legal risks. ADCO is also trusted by one of the largest social agencies in the Asia-Pacific region to give them legal advice to mitigate risks related to severance packages in accordance with Indonesian employment law. We also have broad experience in representing employees who are facing an unlawful termination process, where we successfully assisted them through dispute resolutions at the Industrial Relations Court in Indonesia. ADCO earns the trust to represent clients from multinational companies to emerging entities across a wide range of industries to achieve their business objectives in Indonesia. We strive to help you overcome the challenges of competition in the global economy.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the second discussion session in ADCOTalks 2023, Thinking Outside Pandora's Box. In the first session, we have watched and listened on the various threats of 2023 global recessions, impacts, and settlement forums with Christopher Johnston, Alexandra Gerungan, Morales Sundusing, and James Morrison. Of course, this second discussion will be no less interesting. In this second session, the moderator and the panelists will bring all of us to discuss the global economy and corporate actions in the midst of global recession, a topic that is certainly very hot and has been awaited by all of us. In the first session, we received lots of interesting questions from the participants. So in the end of this session, we also open a questions and answer time. For those of you who would like to ask questions, please do so by putting your questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Bagi Anda yang ingin mengajukan pertanyaan dengan menggunakan bahasa Indonesia, kami persilakan untuk menuliskan pertanyaan Anda melalui kolom Q&A di bawah layar Zoom Anda. Before we go, I would like to greet the moderator for the second discussion session, Dedi Adisuryo. Dedi, how are you?
I'm good, Lisa. How are you?
I'm awesome. Dedi, of course, we do not want to make our audience wait any longer. So please, Dedi, the floor is yours.
Okay, baik. Thank you, Lisa. Thanks for the participants, the attendees, friends, colleagues, and also clients. And also thanks for the speakers we have here, Pak Alta, Pak Marius, and Pak Roy. So we have two sessions today. The first sessions talk about the potential dispute in SIC, the employment reductions, and all of kind of the dispute things. And this second sessions we have today in this afternoon, I'll be moderating the discussions about the corporate actions and also about the tax exposure. By the topic we have here, global economy and corporate actions in the midst of global recessions. So before we start, maybe just for introductions, the 2023 global recession places the global economy and market at the high risk of adverse impact at both the micro and the macro level. At the macro level, global inflation could affect the currency disparities as foreign exchange rates collapse. This will certainly be the test of the readiness of other countries, including Indonesia, regarding financial actions plan and the tax exposure they will face. And on the other hand, at the micro level, this global recession phenomenon not only led the corporate actions, such as merger and acquisitions, the thing that we'll discuss by Pak, but also risk and impact that can occur during the global recessions. So based on those statements, we will have our panelists here to discuss, to share their view, to share their ideas and thought and experience about a couple of interesting things. The first is the navigating ongoing project. And also the second is the legal risk, M&A transaction in the global recessions. And last but not least, managing finance and tax exposure during a crisis. So before I'll give a time and opportunity to each of the speakers, maybe I will read the biography, the background of our distinguished speakers. The first speaker will be Pak Marius Toiming. Pak Marius is partner from K&L Gates in Singapore office. Marius Tomi is a project energy and infrastructure professional based in Singapore, has experience in Asia more than 15 years, including major corporate and project transaction with a particular focus on developing market of Southeast Asia, including Indonesia. The second speaker will be Pak Alta Mahandara. Pak Alta Mahandara at the time being is a partner at ADCOTalks. Alta Mahandara is a qualified lawyer with over a decade of practice under his belt. Alta has vast experience representing clients in diverse industries, including oil and gas, financial services, and insurance, property, environment, maritime, shipping, forestry and plantations. Alta is also recognized for his thorough understanding of a contract and agreement like facility loan agreement, FIDIC, and so on and so on. And the third speaker, I think he is the only non-lawyer speaking person here, is Pak Roy Siboya. He's a partner at Ernst & Young, EY. Yeah, Pak Roy Siboya is a director in advisory services with a major exposure in M&A, structuring, international tax services, corporate financial and tech advisory, and also transfer pricing. He has experienced more than 20 years in various industry with strong credential in the property development, construction, infrastructure, mining, telco, power, and IPP sectors. Pak Marius, Pak Alta, Pak Roy, I'm so happy to have you all here. So the first sessions will be for Pak Marius. He will discuss and share the view about the navigating the ongoing project. So maybe, Pak Marius, you have 5 to 10 minutes to share your idea and thought. Pak Marius, time is yours.
Thank you very much, Pak Dendi, for the kind introduction, and very happy to be here today. Welcome to all of our participants in this webinar. And as Pak Dendi mentioned, I'm just going to make a few very brief remarks to really kick off the discussion around navigating ongoing projects in Indonesia in the face of recessionary risks. And to do that, I'm just going to touch on very briefly the macroeconomic picture and a few bit of the data that's been put out by the IMF. So next slide, please. So the graph on the left shows the main risks that's part of corporate chatter as a percentage of the total number of risk mentions during the survey. And you can see that the risks to the outlook continue to generally be on the downside, and risks are fairly elevated at the moment while we're all grappling with the impact of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and also a slowdown of economic activity as central banks around the world ramp up efforts to quell inflation, together with the lingering pandemic and the damage caused during COVID-19. So if all of these risks are realized, namely inflation, recessionary risks, the Ukraine war, and the pandemic, this is sort of more likely to depress growth further and probably keep inflation higher for longer. And these are really the risks that are at the top of the mind for the world's largest firms at the moment as they navigate a very uncertain environment. So while the inflationary risks you can see are rising rapidly, firms are also focusing on the pandemic still. Despite easing of lockdowns and so forth, I think there still is a concern, for example, about the effects on labor market, the effects on supply chains, and that's probably why we're seeing still that particular risk being dominant. But further complicating the outlook is really how these different risks interact with each other. And of course, Ukraine seems to have a very clear impact in terms of energy and food prices, but there is interrelations between all of these risks, and that's adding to the uncertain environment. And in an uncertain environment, as we'll come to, that certainly presents challenges from an M&A perspective. For the graph on the right, as you can see, sort of coming into Q4 of this year, we're seeing many countries around the world, I think coming up to about 35, have had some sort of GDP contraction. And if that happens, if in 2 quarters consecutively, then some economists call that a technical recession. So you can see, those contractions have really spiked together with inflation. And that's not something that economists were necessarily predicting at the start of this year. Next slide, please. So if we move on to looking at the inflation rates, and the graph on the left, you can see two lines. Apologies if it's a little small on your screen. One is the dotted line, and the other category is the clear line. The dotted line was the forecast back in April, and the other lines represent the more recent forecasts. And as you can see, the GDP growth rates, amongst emerging economies as well as the developed world, are moderating significantly. I think once we get to that 2 to 4% mark in terms of GDP growth, we're looking at sort of on global terms, we're looking at even around the level of the Great Recession in 2009 and so forth. What we can see, however, is that the more emerging countries, and I think Indonesia is no exception, is still registering fairly robust growth, around 5%. That may drop down a little bit. So I think this GDP slowdown of growth is more pronounced in the West. But of course, given the interconnected nature of the global economy, that is likely to have flow-on effects. And at the same time, interest rates are rising, and that also has an impact from a transactional perspective. If the cost of financing goes up, then particularly for leverage deals, we're going to see deals potentially not being as attractive as they were earlier in the year when rates were lower. Next slide, please. So turning to the M&A environment, certainly M&A is going to become more challenging. We've seen after a really bumper year in 2021, we've seen M&A deals drop off, and quite a big contraction you can see in Q3 of this year. Although we're not in an actual recession yet, I think it's probably fair to say that there is some rocky times ahead. And so we need to consider, what the risks are and how they could be best allocated and mitigated, and, what your advisors can do to help shepherd investors through this process. Before I get on to, some of the risks and how to mitigate them, perhaps also just to note that, there's potentially, opportunity comes out of these types of scenarios. And for example, earlier in the year, a report by Bain Consulting mentioned that in the private equity sphere, at least, investment returns are actually the highest immediately after a recession. So you may have a interesting effect in some markets where there'll actually be increased demand for profitable companies, on lower valuations due to the overall depressed environment, but that may have a larger swing to the upside when the recession subsides. So although we're talking about global recession and risks in today's presentation, it's also important to bear in mind that there is always a light at the end of the tunnel and potential upside and opportunity for those who are taking a very strategic approach. Next slide, please. So how can we mitigate the impact, and what is the role of legal and other advisors to investors given these macroeconomic risks? I think just very briefly to touch on a couple of those. One is the risk of broken deals. As I mentioned, with interest rates going up, but perhaps a deal is not going to look as attractive as it did in the low interest rate environment when equity valuations are also quite high. So we must look very carefully within M&A documentation to look at, what are the timelines to negotiate a deal, what are the potential exit clauses, and how does the due diligence play into that? I think, the recent Twitter acquisition by Elon Musk highlight some of those risks where certain elements of the deal were subject to due diligence, and there was a claim that the number of users had been ramped up due to bots circulating within the Twitter ecosystem. Ultimately, the deal went through, and Mr. Musk's lawyers actually pulled their claim from the courts. We won't know what the inner workings of all of that is, but certainly the fine print of the document seemed to hinge on whether there was a clear exit or not for the buyer. And so really important to look at what are your potential outs, but at the same time, being able to craft a transaction that can still go ahead and realize those opportunities in this environment is, for example, using independent valuers, for example, to adjust purchase price or other trailing royalty mechanisms, which might bring the parties closer to the negotiating table and closer to striking a deal, while still leaving that flexibility within the documentation to deal with certain shocks such as a pandemic and so forth. The second is around supply chain risks. We're seeing this really across sectors, but particularly ones which are dependent on supply chain and supply from Europe, for example, or particular blocks that have been affected more significantly in this regard. It's really important to understand and have advisors who are advising on the deal that understand the impact of not only profitability and operational risks, but also things around supply chain, employment, and general economic conditions, and how those things interplay and how those things may impact on the deal, as well as ESG. And certainly we see this as continuing to be a key consideration within environmental, social governance issues and due diligence around M&A going forward, despite the risks. And just finally, litigation and regulation, and making sure that an effective legal strategy is put in place before we go into rocky waters, so to speak, given the increased risks of litigation and also increased risks of more regulations as governments try to create a buffer and shore up the economy to withstand global shocks. Next slide, please. So just finally, on a note, I think there's a huge amount of positive things coming from Indonesia and great opportunities. I've been talking mostly from a global level, and I think from an Indonesia perspective, particularly with strong commodity prices, with opportunities in the green sector, with the coal retirement mechanisms, for example, that have been recently proposed through the G20, and strong domestic demand. There's still going to be great opportunities, and I think Indonesia is in a fortunate position in that regard. But certainly still important to be attuned to some of these global risks and making sure that they're built into your M&A and project documentation when it comes time to considering structure and implementation of those deals. And on that note, I know I'm slightly over time, so perhaps I could hand the floor back to Pak Dendi. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marius. Very interesting presentations. Maybe we will discuss further during the Q&A sessions about your presentations. Again, thanks for the very interesting presentations. The next speaker will be my friend Pak Alta Mahandara. He will speak about the legal risk of M&A transaction in very specific deals in the global transactions. Pak Alta, 5 to 10 minutes is yours.
Thank you, Pak Dendi. It's great to meet you all on this opportunity. Thank you for all the participants, panelists alike, to have make time for this sharing session. I will be talking about the legal risks of M&A transaction in a global recessions. Firstly, I want to talk about the M&A trends. Generally, as we all know, in facing the risk of recession, people tend to save money and decrease their level of debts. This also applies in M&A trends, whereby the rise of interest rates and inflation may impact on geopolitical uncertainty, which largely affect the buyers in predicting their future ventures and profitability of a certain targeted M&A transaction. This will result in a more cautious approach in executing such projects, as the successfulness of the future investment will be directly impacted on their economic conditions. I believe there may be still some strategic buyers that have capabilities to absorb potential losses by boldly entering into market looking for opportunities, especially looking for potentially cheap deals at the recession situation. And as Pak Marius previously speak about, looking for a profitable return once the recession has passed. Why cheap deals? Is because on the seller side, the trend will likely revolve around the sales of distressed assets. The valuation of such assets may be a bit or even far below under their original market value, as the sellers are looking to generate quick cash to set off their impending debts amidst the recession. Whilst the numbers of M&A transactions increased significantly from 2020 to 2021, I believe we expect a slowdown in 2023, as naturally, the market will be more alert and cautious on executing some M&A projects. However, in the other hand, there are also emergence of new opportunities in the form of new renewable and clean energy projects. The government and internationals alike have provided some inclination to stimulate the growth of the clean energy in Indonesia. In example, maybe all you already know that the government of Indonesia has recently enacted a presidential regulation which proposed to accelerate the development of renewable energy. This is already mentioned by Pak Marius also. Additionally, at the G20, recently the government of Indonesia has received a funding facility from USA to retire their coal power generation. There is also a high interest in carbon offset matters globally, which also has spread to Indonesia, in which the government currently support by issuing new sets of regulation related thereto. Therefore, even though globally the market is on recession, there are also new ventures which could open up to new opportunities in Indonesia specifically. On the hedging and protecting investment assets, for companies which have inorganic investment assets which support its main business, there may be a less risk of loss in global recession. In example, for mining companies which have smelter or jetty company subsidiary, even though the market is on recess, such subsidiaries will still have value to support the business of the parent company. It may even be deemed as a potential source of income, as they can sell it to other companies which may need some alike assets. In the other hand, if the purpose of the investment company is for capital gain, then the company need to assess on what sector will be potential and what sector will need to be evaded as a way to hedge its investment assets. For example, it is almost a global consensus that the recession will hit hard on USA and European countries next year. If the investment assets rely solely with the export activity to such country, then such option of investment need to be evaded, as there will be potentially less activity in such country due to the recession. In the other hand, we need to understand that Indonesian domestic market is so much bigger than its international market, which means the effect of recession may not hit as hard as countries that rely on international market entries. This massive domestic market needs to be viewed as anchor to safeguard your investment assets. Sectors like consumer goods, utilities, foods are designed as a defensive investment assets, which will always have demands in Indonesian massively domestic market. Additionally, it's always a good idea to diversify your investment as a form to hedge your investment asset. If your main investment activity is highly likely to be doomed on recess times, in example, because of depending too much on the West buying power, then if you have other investment in other sector which may not be impacted as hard, then you may have a way to cross-subsidize or even cut losses to your company. On the strategies to conduct M&A in the global inflation, for all circumstances revolve around recession, and global inflation, the first good strategy is to evade potentially bigger loss in Indonesia by investing locally, as it can protect the fund by creating new opportunities for employment and business alike. And in turn, it will generate more buying power in people as represented in workforce and business, and it could fight the effect of inflation. Secondly, always look for opportunities, but do it with extra cautious steps to support the decision, as this can lead into a profitable outcome where others may suffer some losses to its business. The third one is by conducting investment with volatility-proof currencies. In example, to protect the value of your transaction, you can agree on the foreign currency which will have more resiliency on the volatility of forex due to the global inflation. Lastly, all of the above strategy will need to be backed by a strong planning and extensive due diligence prior to the transaction. This is where we, as counsels, as lawyers, surely can help our clients to set up a planning process for the successful M&A transaction. I think that's all from my side, Pak Dendi. And I hope we can do some Q&A later if the audience have some question. Thank you, Pak Dendi, back to you.
Thank you, Pak Alta. Thanks for the nice presentations. I note a couple of things from your presentation, and we will discuss further during the Q&A sessions. Now we have Pak Roy. So Pak Roy, like I mentioned before, you are the only lawyer speaking persons here. So maybe Pak Roy, you will discuss about the managing finance and tax exposure during a crisis. What kind of strategy, what kind of risks in terms of tax and finance, and how the companies can deal with that. So again, same time, 5 to 10 minutes, Pak Roy, time is yours.
Thank you, Pak Dendi. Thank you, everyone. Nice to meet you all. So I think we've heard a lot about the current conditions and macroeconomics things, and just want to touch base a bit. And so we have the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's followed, as we heard before, that it was followed by couple of things like recession in many countries, global recessions, and we have interest rate hikes by central banks in the world trying to fight inflation. We have digital and technology disruptions. In more details, actually, there are a couple of things in relation to macroeconomic factors that make an impact on the finance and also accounting and also tax. The first, as I mentioned, COVID-19 pandemic and geopolitical risks and sanctions. We talk about the Russia and Ukraine war, the increase of oil and gas prices, as we know, the supply chain slowdowns. There's been a lot of shutdowns during the pandemic, shutdowns of the logistic, and will create some effect on the supply chain slowdowns. And followed by from the pandemic, there's inflation happening, and also the central bank's efforts to fight the inflation by increasing the interest rates. There's a climate change policy. We know about the ESG. Even in the last G20 meeting in Bali, all the leaders have also discussed about the ESG and also its resolution. We know about the potential global competitiveness legislation. We see an antitrust movement and also the trade agreement and tariffs. And something that is also interesting, we see transition from LIBOR. So now the LIBOR will no longer be used as a reference for interest rate. And Federal Reserve Board policies, they will be dynamic going forwards. And we see the dynamic in terms of workforce and labor trends. And also we see digital and technology disruptions. So there are many dynamics happening in the world. And in terms of accounting and financial statements, disclosure, and internal control. There will be a lot of impacts happening. There'll be impacts in terms of valuation of the assets and also disclosure of going concern of the business and also about forecast of foreign currency because of the fluctuation of the exchange rate. It's very difficult to estimate the foreign currency. They'll be used in the financial statements and then disclosure about discontinued operation. So in the financial statement or accounting, we need to make many disclosures, including operation that will be discontinued, and then about leasing, about liquidity disclosures, about risks and uncertainties going on in the business of the company, right? And also about the ESG reporting. As we know, in compliance with the ESG standard, many companies will have to report specific ESG reporting. And thankfully, it's a bless that I think we've heard before from the previous speakers that Indonesia, yeah, hopefully Indonesia will not enter into recession. That's something that the government is trying to fight because we're not really connected with the global. We don't really rely on their markets, and we still have strong government spending and strong consumer spending in Indonesia. Indonesia consists of a big population, 270 million people, and we have a strong domestic market. And we can see going forward that this domestic business in Indonesia can still, have some creative financing alternatives in Indonesia. So relying on the foreign investors is one thing, but there are a lot of alternative financing in Indonesia. We see the Indonesian Stock Exchange expands the board from main board, developer board, and also regulation board. Yeah, that enables new startup company to enter into the IDX for IPO. We can we have fintech or P2P financing that is with the objective to help the SME companies for its operation and so on and so forth. So that's one thing that's also interesting. So the next, what, what does a business need to consider in the area of global recession anticipation? First, on the finance side, this is something that is everybody is aware of. It's back to financial fundamentals. Basically back to your basic. Yeah, because we see a lot of groups are expanding to a lot of businesses. The startup companies and evolving from one particular platform into super platform. But by the end of the day, we see the trends that they are going to go back to the financial fundamentals, to the basic of their business. And then you need to set priorities for resource allocations. So resource is really crucial at the moment. Your cash flow, your asset, you need to set priorities for your allocation of your resources and set up action plans. And then, of course, we see many companies are doing cost efficiency program. They are doing selection of factory or office for relocation, trying to relocate offices to a more cheaper location which provides more cheaper labor costs, for instance, and so on and so forth. And then monitor the budget and adjust accordingly. And then, of course, you need to maintain and leverage existing customer or clients or users and win new ones amid of the global recession. That's for the finance side. For the tech side, you need to take advantage of the whole tax or fiscal breaks, incentive, and benefits. In Indonesia, there has been COVID-19 fiscal breaks that the government has been uh, introducing to domestic entrepreneurs in Indonesia. Uh, and there are many exemptions, that and also fiscal breaks that that are available for the entrepreneurs. And also monitor the current developments of the changes in regulations. Like in Indonesia, we have the Omnibus Law and also the Harmonized Tax Law that provides many changes to basically to streamline the whole tax environment and to make it more easier for the entrepreneurs and the businessmen to operate. And also you need to anticipate and update the regulation, the updates on transfer pricing for intercompany transaction if you are having intercompany transactions, because that's also one part that the tax authority will try to hit you hard. Yeah. I think that's all from me. I'm happy to address any questions in the Q&A session. Let me pass it on back to you, Pak Dedi. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Pak Roy. I understand, Pak Roy, you are still positive in COVID right now, or
Yeah, Pak. Sorry. Yeah.
fine,
I
fine.
hope you can listen to my voice clearly. Yeah.
Sure, no problem, Pak. No problem, Pak. I hope speedy recovery, Pak, for you, Pak Roy.
Thank you, Pak.
Yeah. Yes, Bapak, Ibu, and all the participants. Now we come to the Q&A sessions. Again, I invite everyone, participants, attendees, friends, to raise the questions. You can drop the question in the chat. But now I have a couple questions that I already note from the presentations from Pak Marius, Pak Alta, and also Pak Roy. So maybe the way that we will do moving forward is I will ask the questions to each of the speakers, and if the other speakers want to add something or want to step in to jump in the discussions, you are very welcome. Yeah. The first question is for Pak Marius. Pak Marius, I'm quite interested about the risk that you mentioned earlier is about the ESG, the environment, socio, and also governance. Can you elaborate more, Pak Marius, what kind of the risk in ESG that we have to anticipate during the crisis? Actually, that is something quite new, but we just want to understand more about the risks related to the ESG things. Pak Marius?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question, and yeah, my best wishes to Pak Roy as well on the COVID front before I start. I think ESG is something that has been increasingly important, and that we're increasingly seeing sort of impact deal activity. And interestingly, if anything, that momentum around ESG has only grown stronger during the pandemic, and we see that momentum will continue despite recessionary risks. ESG and sustainability is a very big word, and environmental, social, and governance issues really encompass many different aspects of the business. And I think, but at its forefront, ESG was actually sort of born and developed out of an investment philosophy, and that philosophy was really to look at how businesses were valued in the past, which is purely based on profitability, and take a more holistic approach, looking not only at a single metric, but also looking at environmental, social, governance factors. And there has been a number of studies that have shown that businesses that are good and emphasize ESG are actually more profitable and more robust and stable businesses over the long term. And I think that kind of stable value business are the ones that are going to survive. I mean, the old adage, when the tide goes out, we see I think there's nothing wrong with that. Who will be left and floating. And I think that the ESG companies, I think, have shown that test of time. And we have to remember, still the percentages of a number of M&A deals that actually fail unfortunately are still pretty high, around 70% at a global level. I think looking at the business level of ESG, however, it's important to remember at the same time that ESG doesn't have to be something that a business has to focus on: environmental, social, and governance. They can pick and choose what they're good at and focus on those things, and that can in turn play into the investment thesis. So it's not necessarily to say that a company that is not so strong on the environmental side can perhaps have very strong social type of infrastructure internally around how it treats its people, for example, or has a sort of best practice approach when it comes to governance, both at the board of directors and board of commissioner level, for example. So these are things that we practice actually day in, day out. In any case, I think it's really the ESG is the moniker to really focus on specifically those items. And we know that there's huge amounts of investment funds and dry powder around the world that is looking for a home in ESG compliant businesses. So if you're a potential target of an M&A transaction as well, the research has shown that it also pays to focus on ESG. So I think in short, the risks are really for the businesses that don't pay attention to ESG, perhaps are left behind when it comes to investment, when it comes to arranging financing, particularly in a competitive and recessionary environment where businesses may struggle to obtain financing, and banks are in turn under pressure to focus on environmental and other sustainable attributes when they're considering the possibility of delivering loans to their customers.
Thank you for the answer, Pak Marius. The next questions, I have one question for Pak Alta. Yeah. Pak Alta, you said before that there will be still active M&A, especially for the distressed asset, because the valuation of the asset will drop down. It will invite more interest and appetite for companies to take over to acquire such of distressed asset. But in general, what is your view, Pak Alta, M&A during the recessions? Do you see that in overall, do you see that the recession will be deep enough, Pak, to discourage the strategic buyers to come in to Indonesian market, or you view that the M&A will remain robust, considering that what you mentioned before, the distressed asset, the dropping valuation of the company? Pak Alta, your view?
Yes, as I mentioned before, I expect the decrease in the M&A numbers in 2023. But again, there are some light at the end of the tunnel, as Pak Marius already said, that there are some areas that are still potential for this M&A to be flourish in the time of recession, especially for strategic buyers that have maybe quite strong capitals to still do the M&A project and can have the ability to absorb potential losses if the deal goes south. I believe the numbers generally will come down, but then there will still be some potential good M&A transactions because of this distressed asset usually sells on very cheap deals, Pak. And the strategic buyers can buy it and then maintain the ongoing process of the business. And when the recession has passed, they will have an added value to sell it, Pak. Maybe when the price are back to normal. I believe in this, Pak.
I'm so happy, Pat, to hear your answer, Pat. So it means that we will remain busy, Pat, next year, despite of
I believe
the
so.
global recession.
I believe so
Yeah.
because I am seeing at the sectors, especially on the renewable energy and also
Mm.
carbon offset. It is like a race, Pak, currently, because this is like a new thing and have a very wide open opportunities for all of the business actors, yeah, to also play part on that, Pak. So although the recession maybe bring some downtime of economics, but there are still hope, Pak, for the M&A to flourish, especially for that sectors.
Okay, thanks. Before I come to Pak Roy, maybe I want Pak Marius, your view, Pak. Maybe one of the interesting point Pak Alta mentions that the M&A or the project development for the NRE, the new and renewable energy, will flourish next year. Do you have same view on that part? Because I understand you are quite active in that industry. So, what is your view about this industry, the new and renewable energy?
Yeah, look, I agree with Tagal's comments. I think the future is bright, and there's certainly a huge amount of appetite for investment in these new and renewable sectors and opportunities. And we've seen in Indonesia, for example, the ball has already started to get rolling with some of the floating solar PV projects. We're seeing increasing interest, for example, in rooftop solar, particularly with commercial and industrial customers, and renewed impetus, in hydro and geothermal projects as well. And Indonesia's had a long, history of project financing for power projects, particularly in the conventional space. And so, we see opportunities. Of course, there are also challenges as well. Indonesia hasn't been as fast as some of the neighbors in developing renewable energy projects. And I think, some of the internal conflicts within PLN, between the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources and Ministry of Finance, for example, some of the capacity payments, under the existing conventional plants, have held some of the projects back, together with the a feed-in tariff or lack of a feed-in tariff. But I think those things are starting to change. Pagauta mentioned, for example, sort of the CTM program, the potential for carbon offsets, and a growing carbon credit market, and the regulatory developments in those areas. And I think there's a potential is really significant. So I think if the regulatory environment can continue to be reformed to allow investment in those projects, together with stable investment climate and political climate, which we have in Indonesia, I think the future will be quite bright in that sector.
Thank you, Pak. Pak Roy, before I ask you a specific tax-related matters, Pak, maybe I understand you are a very senior and seasoned advisory council, Pak. What do you think, Pak, about the M&A? From your organization, your company, what is your view in 2023? What kind of specific industry that will be active during the crisis in the next year that hopefully will be coming to us?
Yeah, thank you, Pak Dedi. So it's very interesting, if I can make comments there. So, yeah, we see that the digital technology it's still coming in, but we've been helping various clients, various investors coming into the, to the startup unicorn companies, and also that's still going on. But I agree with Pak Marius and Pak Alta that with the ESG coming in, we see that there are a lot of investors who are more interested to renewable energy. Like for instance, we just closed a couple of deals for hydroelectric power plant companies. Yeah, and of course there are still a lot of investors looking at this renewable. And I agree with Pak Mahesh that like the solar panel power plant also is also very interesting, Pak. And electric vehicles is also one thing that we've been helping clients with, including, as we know, the development of the new, EV battery in Indonesia. Yeah, taking use of the raw materials from Indonesia, the nickel. Yeah, it's a big project. Of course, we know that the government and the president has been trying to talk to Tesla, Elon Musk, to try to convince them to come to Indonesia. You know, but the Korean, they already here in Indonesia, the Korean automotive players with with their battery energy company as well. So EV EV ecosystem is here. We see that that the state-owned enterprises in Indonesia is also trying to develop the electric charging stations across Indonesia. There's a lot of homework for that, and we see that there's a concept of big battery swap. So basically, if you want EV car, rather than charging your EV, you can just swap your battery. It's already happening for the two-wheel EV motorcycle, but probably we can use it for the four-wheel EV car. Yeah. So yeah, but it doesn't. Of course, for the other sector that is more like conventional sectors, like commodity, the coal mine. We know that some banks try to don't prefer to give financing for these coal mining companies. Of course, that's one thing that we heard. But they keep on producing, they keep on exporting the coal, right? So the commodity price still good. So despite of the anticipating the global recession, I agree with Alta. We don't see that 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 means that M&A will not be there. There will still be a lot of potential M&A deals. Yeah, of course, there's still a lot of venture capital, private equity funds trying to get into distressed asset in Indonesia or Southeast Asia, and then but they need to wait a little bit longer until they can get a good upside. That's exactly what happened in the previous the early 2000 crisis. Yeah, they could get a good distressed asset and then hold it for a little bit longer and get a good upside. So that's also on the strategic investors. I agree that there are still a lot of strategic investors who are looking to emerging markets like Southeast Asia and Indonesia, with the support that Indonesia, of course, now is getting more popular because of the G20 presidency. That was very successful in Bali, and then we the world knows Indonesia is still strong with the domestic market, the commodity, natural resources, and the population, and so on and so forth. So that's yeah, I think that's something from me, Daily.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Roy. I think I directly come back to Pak Roy. It's about tax-related matter questions, but it's a very layman questions, Pak, coming from one of the audience. What if a company suffer a drop in revenue or suffer loss, during the crisis like what we have in the last 2 years or 3 years? Company laying down so many employees, they are stop operating or they do still the operations, but the revenue drop in a level that they cannot produce more profit, or so What is your view, Pak, for the tax planning, for the tax preparation for this kind of situations? Yeah, drop in revenue, or even worse, suffer a loss, Pak, during the crisis.
Yeah,
Pak Roy.
thank you, Pak Dedi. Actually, that situation happened since the early of the pandemic in early 2020. So many companies are, dropping in terms of the revenue, in terms of the profit. There are many companies suffering losses. So they need to anticipate if uh, if they will, from the tax reporting point of view, they need to anticipate if they're going to report a loss in their tax returns. If they're reporting a loss and if somehow they keep paying that tax repayments, they could end up, that company could end up reporting a tax overpayment. And that tax overpayment can be claimed as a refund to the tax authority. But consequently, it will automatically trigger tax audit by the tax authority of Indonesia. So, and inviting a tax audit is not something that everybody wants to have, actually. You need to make sure that you have a clean book, you have a clean financial statement, you have all the sort of documents, you are ready to battle in the tax audit event, in the next 12 months, because there's a deadline for the tax authority to complete the audit within 12 months. And as you know, they are actually still suffering. The question is that are they ready to get into the battle for the tax audit with the tax authority? Is one thing. Of course, they need to be mindful that they need to prepare everything, the financial statement, the documents ready for the tax audit. That's for the corporate tax. For the if they are registered for VAT, yeah, for value tax, it is also possible, but that they could end up because of the drop of the revenue. The output VAT will drop, right? If they still have accumulated input VAT from the previous years, they could come up to have VAT of payment. So quite similar with the corporate tax, the VAT of payment, can also be claimed as a refund. But again, will automatically trigger tax audit. And to be for them to trigger the tax audit, they need to be ready. To be ready in terms of having a clean balance, financial statement, books, records, and so on and so forth. But for VAT, if they don't want to trigger the tax audit, they can just carry over the overpayment for the next periods. So basically, it's still going to be sitting in the receivable in the balance sheet or the financial statements. Yeah, that's one comment. The next comment is that in the last COVID-19 era, the government has been giving a lot of breaks, fiscal breaks, reduction of the payroll tax to certain industry for laborers, manpowers, reduction of certain taxes. With the objective to reduce the tax burden for everybody, for the entrepreneur, for the company, and also for the people. But I think that's all. It's over now. Yeah. I think that's all. Pak Dedi, thank you.
Thank you, Pak Roy. Before I ask another questions to Pak Marius and Pak Alta and Pak Roy, I once again invite everyone to drop your questions. You can drop in Q&A sessions, or you can directly chat to my inbox chat, like what one participant did before. Pak Marius, I have actually one questions for you, Pak, because see sometimes in your field part for the project development, we sign agreement, we sign a project right now, but the project will run maybe 3 or 4 years later on. So in this case, maybe we sign something right now where the crisis is not coming, but the implementations period of such project development contracts will be happening during the crisis. So maybe, Pak, we need your view on what kind of specific clauses or provisions that we need to insert in the agreement, or what kind of strategical approach to make the agreement during the crisis, the project agreement during the crisis can be done not in a sense can be executed, but can be factually implemented, reaching commercial operations without having any unnecessary dispute. But Marius, your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think the starting point is always to look at the big picture and then get into the detail. And so when we're looking at an overall long-term project context, it's really important to look at what the key risks are and then drill down into how they're going to be allocated and mitigated within the contract documents. And usually for big projects, we're talking about many project agreements. And it's really important to not only look at those agreements in isolation, but how they interface with each other and the different parties and stakeholders involved. So that's the first point, looking at the big picture, looking at the broad risk allocation and who is sort of best placed to bear the risk. The second one at the contract level, as lawyers and, as you'll be very familiar with as well, Pat Dendi, we have a number of tools in our toolkit to address events that may occur after the contract is signed that perhaps weren't necessarily anticipated. And even though we're talking about very lengthy documents that may run into hundreds of pages, there's never any way that we can predict everything and document everything that potentially could occur later down the track. So there's a few different mechanisms. One is around the material adverse effect clauses I mentioned earlier, to look at if there is an event that occurs that has a material impact on the target, let's say in an M&A context, is there an ability for the buyer to walk away for the deal? And this was something that was looked at by quite a number of courts. There was a very big EU case around the acquisition of Tiffany, the jewelry company, and also in Singapore, actually, there's a telecommunications deal over 1 billion, which went up to the Court of Appeal as well, which dealt with a similar issue. And that was, the deal was signed. Later down the track, between signing and completion, pandemic occurred, and the buyer's looking for an escape clause. And I think, what was very clear from both of those cases is that the court's decisions very much hinged on contract interpretation, looking at the specific terms of the clauses that had been written into those contracts. And it really emphasizes how important it is to make sure that you have robust and detailed documentation to deal with those issues. Usually the way the clause is drafted, at least in the instance of the Singapore case I mentioned, the effect was of the relevant event, in this case, the pandemic, must not only have an impact on the business, it had to have a disproportionate effect on that particular target business compared to other businesses operating within a similar sphere. And so, ultimately, the interpretation and application of the provision not only had legal elements to it, it also had commercial judgment as well. And so, it hinged on making sure that appropriate experts were in place to determine financial and tax advisors to determine the specific impacts on the business and not the event as a whole. And this is where, one of the kind of sticky points will come in to negotiate these provisions is to look at, what exactly is the impact, and then, what are the consequences of that impact? In the case of the Tiffany deal, I think ultimately there was a renegotiation of the price downwards. So having the clause did allow that leverage to buy in at a lower price. And, the parties averted, very expensive and probably protracted litigation. But the interesting element is, if there was sort of slightly different drafting within the clauses, how that would have panned out. The other main tool within the toolkit, of course, around force majeure provisions. This is also talked about, in a lot of detail, during the pandemic when everyone was scrambling around, trying to find the contractors, gathering dust probably in a drawer in an office somewhere, and then instructing counsel to get into the detail of force majeure, looking at the general force majeure and the conditions to be met to suspend a party affected by the force majeure event's obligations under the agreement, and then the specific lists and examples of events as the clause is typically drafted. But again, even there, in many cases, the litigation centered around the specific drafting of the provisions. And in my experience in Indonesia, as with many countries in ASEAN, there is no one market standard clause. You may have an APLMA and FIDIC certain provisions, but they're often adjusted. And particularly for long-term projects, these things often developed and hammered out, negotiated around the table on a very bespoke basis. But it's important to bear in mind the overriding considerations. And finally, just to touch on indemnities, termination provisions, and warranties. Again, coming back to the M&A context, really important. And how do you deal with perhaps not necessarily very general macroeconomic shocks, but perhaps some of the things that Pak Roy was mentioning a little while ago that may only be revealed in audited financial statements that are going to be ready in 9 or 10 months. Perhaps the April of the following year, if the financial year of the company ends 31st December. And so how do you build in sufficient warranty periods, for example, to make sure that any of those risks and issues that are thrown up out of the audit process are properly mitigated? And how do you have appropriate indemnification around potential tax and other claims that have arisen prior to signing or prior to completion? And then finally, change of law provisions, which are sometimes overlooked compared to perhaps force majeure and termination clauses, but can be equally as important, particularly in a recessionary environment where the risk of further regulation and heavily regulated sectors in particular, like renewables and utilities, likely to see continue to see continued movement and regulatory movement. So how do you allocate the risks of regulation changes and licensing effects? And I think those clauses can provide a useful framework and mechanism to flag up these kind of issues, what sort of impact they're having on the deal, and ultimately how the liability is shared or borne between the parties to the transaction.
Thank you. Excellent, Pak Marius. Pak Atta, I think similar questions to you, Pak. What do you think? What kind of key provision or what kind of key approach that you can advise to your clients what to do in the M&A deals during the crisis period? What do you think about this, Pak?
Yes, Pak. Similar to Pak Marius, we as a lawyer have so many tools in our toolkit. So basically, it will depends on who are we representing, Pak, on whether we go to the details or we go to the general provision. My main focus on related to this matter will be on the force majeure clauses, Pak, because if we expect that we already know at this time when we are entering into an agreement that maybe have a long-term process or a long-term contract, we need to be specific on what matters need to be included in the force majeure clauses, Pak. For example, we can put that our obligation to do something inside an agreement need to depend also on the environment of economic environments of the country and everything, but we can put that in there, Pak. But then again, it will still depends on the dispute, ya, Pak, because I have experienced that in certain contracts there are force. It's my experience on the pandemic era, ya, Pak. So basically, there are in the force majeure clauses that states pandemic as a force majeure, and then the other party pull up the card that they suffer a force majeure in front because of the pandemic. Then it's not as easy as that, Pak, because the arbiters or the judges will dig down deeper on whether such force majeure is included or not. In my case, for instance, the contract is signed at the pandemic era. So why the hell did you ask for force majeure if you already in the pandemic era? It's the same like this recession, Pak. I think if you are on the client side that are reluctant to include this, I think you need to be put more general force majeure clauses, Pak. I think it's the technical matters, Pak, that we can sharpening or fine tuning at each of the types of the agreements, Pak. We can help that with our clients, supposedly, Pak. I think that's all.
Okay, thank you, Pak Atta. I think I have one final moment to have your closing statement. But after hearing all explanations from Pak Marius, Pak Roy, and also Pak Alta, I don't think crisis will be here because where I can smell, I can feel, I can see positive vibes instead of a negative side. So and again, I just take some note from what Pak Marius mentioned in his earlier presentations. Yeah, that the inflation rate from Indonesia is still single digit. I think that's much better compared to other countries. What we have in Turkey, they have an inflation more than 70%. As the same thing also happening in the couple of European companies. And also the corrections to the USD exchange rate against the rupiah, the correction is only in my note is only 7%, and the economic growth, like what Pak Marius note, 5.1%. So I think Indonesia is still in a good shape, and hoping that we can survive or we can navigate ourselves during the crisis. But your closing statement, Bapak-bapak, all gentlemen, what proactive step can be taken to make a company future ready during this crisis? Pak Roy, maybe you can make a closing statement in terms of taxations. Pak Marius, you can make statement in terms of ESG or project deals, and Pak Alta, you can make a closing statement related to the M&A deals. Maybe the first closing statement, Pak Roy, maybe your first turn, Pak.
Yeah, thank you, Pak Dendi. So I agree with you. I always want to be optimistic rather than pessimistic. So there's always two sides of a coin, And for lawyers, consultants, there's always deals, M&A deals. Even for when companies trying to sell off their assets, there's always M&A deal. So in terms of finance, accounting and tax, you need to be ready to sharpen your business. Of course, as I mentioned, there's a cost efficiency, cost reduction program. You need to try to utilize your resources, set up priorities for your resources in your budget, and of course, and then you need to be ready, of course, to do proper tax reporting. So when everything goes well, and then we exit from this condition, and we can go back to normal. And then back to your basic financial fundamentals, yeah. And then basically, rather than being more aggressive, expanding to many diseases, but going back to your basic. I think that's all from me. But
Thank you, Pak Roy. Next turn is Pak Alta. Pak Alta, your closing statement, Pak. What proactive steps can be taken to make a company
Yes.
future ready, Pak?
Yes, thank you, Pak. So basically, as Pak Chris in session 1 already said, we are in a very unique times of crisis, yeah. Because previously, if we are on crisis, we already hit first, and then we think, yeah. But at the moment, we have a luxury to plan ahead, because we know that something big will happen on the future. So I think the most important steps to be taken is for the planning steps for the transaction. So all the transaction, M&A transactions, and maybe other corporate action need to be backed up with a strong due diligence and planning process, Pak. So for that transaction to be successful, we know that the crisis will come, and so we have to be ready, and we have to prepare the mitigation of the risk that may come up. I think that's all, Pak. And we need to see optimistically, because the future, I think, is bright. Thank you, Pak.
Thank you, Pak Alta. Pak Marius, what proactive steps can be taken to make company future ready? Your closing statement, Pak Marius.
Absolutely, and I agree with all of the comments, and I think there's a lot to be optimistic about in the Indonesian market. Particularly now that travel restrictions have been lifted, and there's more ability to travel and to visit project sites and really get things moving again around the negotiating table. I also agree absolutely that preparation is key, and the benefit of some foresight and planning and preparation will be really, really helpful. There's simple things that companies can do. For example, look at their contract templates, make sure that they are in place. If you need to move quickly on a deal, having a robust set of documentation to start with makes a really big difference. Secondly, look at corporate handbooks. If we know that regulatory environment and litigation, maybe things that are going to spike due to downward pressure and risks, look at how those things can be sort of refined and really communicated through the organization. Finally, when you're looking particularly at a new project, structuring and having the right structure from the start is really important. And in the M&A context, perhaps entering into a type of corporate reorganization to find the optimal corporate structure can also be really useful in order to prepare the business for sale and for future risks, whether that's divesting certain assets into non-core holdings, creating more bankruptcy remote structures, or preparing for reorganizations that allow financing to come in at different levels, bearing in mind all of the tax considerations that Pak Roy has mentioned. So there's plenty of things that companies can do to prepare, not only for the risks, but also for some of the opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you. Pak Roy, Pak Alta, Pak Marius, thank you very much for your few ideas and thought on us. I learned a lot today. I got so many lessons from you. So once again, thank you, Pak, for your sharings. And I don't want to make conclusions on these discussions, because what I think is all the discussions that you made are always everything is a conclusion. And again, I hope everyone, all the participants, can get something insightful from whatever we discussed today. Hope you can enjoy the rest of the discussion. And back to you, Lisa.
Thank you. What a remarkable dialogue. Dendi Adisuryo, together with the panelists, Marius Toime, Alta Mahandara, and Roy Sibuya. We believe all points that we have elaborated in the dialogue have added new insights to all of our audiences in preparation for the global recession, and of course, bring all of us to the positive vibes for the 2023. Before we close the session, I invited the moderator and all the panelists to take a group photo. I will help you to count, so please, Dendi, Alta, Roy, and Marius. Please give your best smile. 3, 2, 1. Once again, 3, 2, 1. Thank you very much for the discussion, Dendi Adisuryo, Alta Mahandara, and our two guest speakers, Marius Toime and Roy Sibuya. To the moderator and the panelists, you can leave the Zoom webinar. Once again, thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Pak Roy. Thank you, Pak Marius. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, before we end this session, I encourage all of you in providing your feedback for today's dialogue. You can click the link in the box below or scan the barcode on your Zoom screen. You can scan the barcode on your Zoom screen. All input and constructive criticism will greatly affect the quality of the next ADCOTalks. Please fill out the feedback form. We will be waiting for 2 minutes. Participants, while you are filling out the feedback form, I would like to inform you that ADCOTalks is a routine program held by ADCO by inviting business experts and legal professionals, including our respected clients and all of our stakeholders, to listen to the up-to-date legal issues. If you would like to attend at the next ADCOTalks, you can check our latest updates on the website at www.adcolaw.com or on our Instagram at ADCOLaw. Once again, your input and constructive criticism in the feedback form will greatly support us in preparing the better ADCOTalks. Thank you for your participation in today's dialogue ADCOTalks 2023 Thinking Outside Pandora's Box. Semoga Anda dapat kembali hadir dan menyimak dialog mengenai beragam isu terkini dari para business experts dan legal professionals dalam ADCOTalks selanjutnya. Thank you and see you in the next ADCOTalks.